So I am Sharia Ali. I am the SLP advisor at AXLPA. Today you will have the pleasure of not hearing me present, and you will have the privilege of listening to Randal Bell, who will be sharing some information on the Indigenous health crisis. As healthcare workers and as folks who live on Indigenous land, we all have a role to play and an obligation to work towards reconciliation and decolonizing healthcare. So we're very grateful Randal's able to join us today to help us along with our individual journeys with this. So Randal, I'll let you get started in a minute, but I just have some housekeeping notes, my usual spiel that I have to go through. So first is that Randal has very graciously allowed us to record today's presentation. Thank you again to him. So members will get an email notification of when that recording is available for viewing. The other note I have is please let us know in the chat if you are having technical difficulties. If your technical difficulties are such that the chat isn't available to you, give our office a call and someone can help you figure things out from there. You'll notice that your cameras and your mics are off. They're going to stay off while Randal is presenting his slides, just to minimize disruptions. But when we get to the question period, you'll have the option to put your question in the chat or to raise your hand, and we can give you access to turn your mic and your camera on so you can ask your question in a more person-to-person way. So we'll ask that you hold your questions until the end, or if you type your question in the chat as it comes to you, just be mindful that we won't be able to respond to it until we get to the question period. We do have a longer webinar today. It is slated to go until 1:30, but of course we understand if folks need to dash off at 1 to get back to work. Thank you in advance. If this is you, I won't get a chance to thank you for joining us at the end. And so I think that's all for me. So I will mute myself and turn my camera off, and I will pass the presentation space over to Randal whenever you're ready, Randal.
Wonderful. Thank you, Shreya. Mio Kasipio, Asanemas Masqua, Nistatigasun Munio Sagahigini, Isigu, Nitaskina, Nihao, Nia Montreal Lake, Nihao, Nation Oche, Ote Saskatchewan. Hello and good day. Stone Bear is my name. Randal Bell is my given name. Stone Bear being my Cree name. I'm a member of Montreal Lake Cree Nation in Saskatchewan. And I'd like to start out by thanking Shreya, Susan, and Mackenzie for having me here today to share this message with you. And I'm aware that we do have limited time, and I want to leave as much space as possible for a conversation afterwards. I really think that those conversations are just as important as the presentation itself, if not more so. So with that, Igwa, let's go. My mom would always clap her hands when she says that, much like a drill sergeant. Okay, so today we're going to be talking a little bit about what I call the Indigenous health crisis. We're going to talk about the trauma of Indigenous people. We're going to talk about intergenerational trauma, and ultimately the adverse childhood experiences and how they perpetuate the Indigenous health crisis. We'll talk a little bit about social determinants of health, how they contribute. And finally, we'll talk about reconciliation in healthcare and how we can all be a part of that solution. And just let me know if I'm going a little bit fast. I just had a coffee. So this is a picture of the whitest little treaty Indians you ever saw. That's a picture of me and my daughter Mackenzie. Her Cree name is Piwapan, which means sunrise. And she was given her Cree name through ceremony shortly after this picture was taken, much like myself. we get these names through ceremony. But you can see genetics at work in this picture. By the end of this presentation, I'm sure you will have formed an opinion one way or the other, whether she was blessed with really good genetics or cursed with really bad ones. But let's take a second here and talk about genetics. 11 years ago, I guess it would be 12 years ago now, researchers blew the scent of a cherry blossom into the cages of adult male mice while zapping their feet with electricity. And after being zapped a few times, these traumatized mice associated the smell of cherry blossoms with pain. Now, these traumatized male mice were bred with females, and when their pups smelt the scent of a cherry blossom, they became more jumpier and more nervous than pups whose fathers had not been traumatized. Well, maybe they learned this behavior from their parents. Nope, they were raised by completely unrelated mice who had never smelt a cherry blossom. The second and third generation didn't fear the scent itself, but had a heightened sensitivity to it. And so the finding of this research supports the theory that the next generation doesn't always show exactly the same trait that their parents had. It's not the fear that's being passed down through the generations. It's the fear of a scent in one generation that leads to a sensitivity in the next. Now, another study went a step further. They extracted the RNA molecules from the sperm of male mice who had been traumatized, and they injected them into the embryos of mice whose parents had not been traumatized. Now, the resulting pups, however, still showed those typical altered behavioral patterns of pups whose parents experienced trauma. Now, we'll come back to mice and the cherry blossoms and whether or not the epigenetic effect of trauma is real. But I can tell you from my own personal and professional experiences that the connection between historical trauma and the current Indigenous health crisis is as real as the rivers and the rocks. Let's start out with historic trauma. And what is historic trauma? Well, in the initial phase, the dominant culture perpetuates mass trauma on a population in the form of colonialism, slavery, or war, genocide. That second phase, the affected population shows psychological symptoms in response to this trauma. And in the final phase, the initial population passes these responses to trauma onto subsequent generations, who in turn display similar symptoms. And you can probably see how the phases of historic trauma are very similar to the epigenetic responses observed in the cherry blossom mice. This is the now famous painting by Kent Monkman called The Scream. Undeniably a visceral depiction of that exact moment people like my mother were ripped away from their family and home and shipped off to residential schools. In the 50s, my grandfather had spent 5 years in prison for killing a moose off the reserve. And when he was released, he was deathly afraid of the police and going back to prison. And so after about a month at residential school, my mother and my Aunt Ginny ran away from residential school, making it all the way back to the trap line, traversing some 50 kilometers of unforgiving North Saskatchewan forest. A few days later, the police show up at the trap line with the school administrator. He catches my 7-year-old mom and he bloodies her nose right in front of my grandfather. And my mother said her father did nothing in her defense, and she never forgave him for that until she was in her 40s and he was on his deathbed. She said it had taken her that long to figure out that they had broken him in prison. And by the time he had gotten home, he had no fight left in him. He knew he was powerless against the colonial police and the colonial government. And so my mother was taken back to residential school. So this is my mother. Her Cree name is Eagle Whistle Woman. Given name is Ivy Bell. Ivy is a Cree woman from Montreal Lake Cree Nation, and she suffered every kind of child abuse imaginable in the community she was raised in, and more of the same at residential school. And as an adult, she suffered through years of domestic violence. Most of her adult life, she had struggles with PTSD, anxiety attacks, depression, suicidal thoughts. And to cope with her traumatic memories and her emotional pain she had suffered, she would self-medicate with substance use for many years. But she found a way out. At 32, she left an abusive partner and went back to school, got with her grade 9 education, and she finished her GED. And now a single mom with 3 hungry kids, she went on to university. At 35, she found Indigenous culture and adopted a traditional Indigenous lifestyle free from substance use. And after finishing a bachelor's degree in social work, she went on to finish her master's degree. She's been a successful, self-employed mental health therapist now for over 20 years. She's traveled all over the world, seeing places she'd only dreamed about as a child. She's achieved many of the goals she once thought impossible. And my mother's story is one of strength, courage, and ultimately hope. She personifies resilience and But as you examine the Indigenous health crisis, you'll see my mother and I are an exception rather than the rule. But ultimately, my mother's traumatic childhood is not unique. Indigenous people have been exposed to over 120 years of colonization and assimilation policies, and the legacy of those policies are alive and well today. Over 150,000 Indigenous children were taken away from their families and placed in residential schools, like the one my mother went to. The odds of returning from World War II were 1 in 26, and the odds of dying in residential school were 1 in 25. Thousands of residential school survivors recall incidents of physical, emotional, and sexual abuse, underage pregnancy, starvation, malnutrition, torture, and even murder. I say torture, and people often say, really? Okay. Well, there's a residential school in Quebec where they found an electric chair in the basement. It was small enough that only a child would fit into. The 60s scoop comes along in the 1960s and means another 20,000 children are taken away. The millennial scoop means another 22,000 children taken away. Of course, we have the modern child welfare state in which 53.8% of all children in care are Indigenous. In 2021, the Honorable Dr. Carolyn Bennett said, there are more kids now than there were at the height of residential schools. It's unacceptable and it's harmful. But to understand how all of this trauma affects people like my mother, we first need to appreciate the health consequences of adverse childhood experiences. If you're not familiar with ACEs or adverse childhood experiences, here's a crash course. Between 1995 and 1997, Dr. Vincent Felitti led a study of over 17,000 adults in California. These participants completed confidential surveys regarding their childhood experiences with the 10 traumatic experiences listed here. The study showed that childhood traumas lead to poor health outcomes and social problems experienced later in life. The more trauma they had, the more health problems they developed. Essentially, a child survives a traumatic adverse childhood experience, is exposed to toxic stress. The child then has disrupted neurological development and response. I'm sure many of you have experienced this in your clinical practice. They struggle with social, emotional, and cognitive impairments. They don't fit in with the other children. Later, they cope with these difficulties through high-risk behaviors like habitual substance use. And over time, trauma and all that comes with it becomes autocatalytic, eventually leading to chronic disease, disability, or social problems, and ultimately an early death. The presence of high ACE scores in childhood are now commonly associated with higher rates of obesity, higher rates of cancer, diabetes, heart disease, COPD, heart rates, higher rates of addiction and mental health issues, incarceration, and even homelessness. There's a study in 2022 that looked at 1,679 adults in Philadelphia, and they found that individuals who had more than 4 ACEs tended to live in neighborhoods with higher neighborhood poverty rates, less socioeconomic resources, worse food security, poor perceived physical and mental health, more substance use, more overdose deaths, higher crime, and even less green space. You can literally predict which neighborhood someone will live in based on how many adverse childhood experiences they've had. So like my mother before us, all 3 of us score or would likely score 10 out of 10 on the ACEs survey. We grew up in an extremely dysfunctional household with extremely abusive stepfather. Substance abuse and domestic violence were commonplace, daily occurrences. We suffered many forms of child abuse and neglect. It was an unpredictably violent place to grow up, devoid of any safety, structure, or stability. We experienced extreme poverty and food insecurity on a daily basis. I used to get hungry to the point where I would tell my little sister to drink water so she wouldn't feel hungry. And now my mother had many of the same experiences in her childhood, and her siblings also suffered from the same adverse childhood experiences. And so the story of my extended family isn't much different. The story of my extended family isn't much different from our own. 5 of my cousins are my age and went to residential school. Some of them are younger than me. You know, we quite often talk about residential schools as being this dark chapter in the history of Canada 100 years ago. No, there's people younger than me that went to residential school, many of them my cousins. At least 20 of my cousins have been in foster care and had their children taken away, foster care. 3 of my cousins were murdered before they were 25. 2 of my cousins have mothers who are missing and murdered Indigenous women. 1 of my nephews recently died in a fentanyl overdose. 5 others have survived fentanyl overdoses. And so through the course of my career, I've sought to understand why our family is so different from yours. Why is it different from everyone else's? What the hell is wrong with us? Why is our family so different? So in 2016, a brilliant young man, well, kind of young, led a study of Indigenous high-need service users. These are predominantly homeless individuals with multiple episodes of care and addictions in mental health facilities. The inner ring represents the service user's childhood, the middle ring represents their teenage years, and the outer ring represents their adult years. And it comes as no surprise that there were adverse childhood experiences. But what was interesting was that trauma exposure in most cases increases with age. So it's not just adverse childhood experiences that Indigenous people were experiencing. It was an escalation of trauma throughout the course of their natural lives. And at the time, we thought the levels of trauma were as bad as it can get. And then we interviewed 100 high-need service users who were incarcerated. And we saw patterns of trauma exposure that were much worse. As you can see, the levels of trauma exposure were more than double the high-need service users in some key categories. 98% indicating they had a substance use problem, 95% indicating that they had suffered from anxiety, depression, or suicidal ideation, PTSD. Of the 200 people that we interviewed, 41% were residential school survivors. 75% of these participants had parents or a parent who attended residential school. Many were survivors of the 60s scoop or had grown up in multiple foster homes as children. Many recall the loss or disappearance of a significant female figure in their lives. It's interesting to note that all of the men and women we interviewed, all 200 of them, have or had children who were at the time growing up without their parents, without a parent. And so I ask you to think about where those children are or where they're going to end up, knowing that they grew up without one of their parents or both of their parents. And so the cycle continues. A year ago, I had a cardiac episode and I was undergoing a lot of tests, one of them being a 24-hour blood pressure monitor that checks on your blood pressure every 30 minutes. And so I'm doing this presentation at the University of York, and while going through the slide, my blood pressure monitor starts to vibrate and check my blood pressure. And while I was a bit embarrassed at this noisy disruption in the middle of my presentation, it actually hit me for the very first time that I'm seeing myself in these statistics. I've always been a relatively competitive athlete, so in the terms of my own health, I suppose I was an exception to the rule. Now I know that I'm not, and neither is my mother. She has arthritis, asthma, COPD. She's had strokes. Over the holidays, she moved in with me as she was starting chemotherapy, and she had another heart attack. And so looking at this chart, you see that people like me and my mother are an extremely high risk for heart disease, heart attack, and cancer. And it just goes to show you might outrun your history, but biology will catch up with you eventually. And so it's all about trauma. No, it's not all about trauma. In the case of Indigenous health, trauma starts the fire, but it's really the social determinants of health that keep that fire burning. What are the social determinants of health? Typically, we're talking about food security, income, education, employment, housing, healthcare, and ultimately social context, your community. So when we have good determinants of health, we have lower health risks and we have better health outcomes. And when we have bad social determinants of health, we have bad health outcomes. It's pretty simple, right? Well, 28 years ago, 29 years ago, the Royal Commission on Aboriginal People raised the alarm on the poor social determinants of health and the poor health of Indigenous people. They begged the government of Canada to do something about it. So let's take a look at how much things have improved. In 2019, the proportion of Indigenous people with moderate or severe food insecurity is more than double that of the overall population. 2015, Indigenous people and Indigenous communities that were age 15 and over had a median income of just $16,000, approximately half of the median income of non-Indigenous Canadians at $34,000. And I was hoping for new numbers in the 2021 release, but they're quite misleading with the COVID relief money that was released. But ultimately, what I'm saying here, poverty is a barrier to health services, right? Because putting food on the table is always going to take priority over seeing a doctor 100 kilometers away if you're in a rural or remote community. Poor education and training opportunities affect Indigenous health. 31% of people living in Indigenous communities were considered low income, compared with only 11% of non-Indigenous Canadians. Unemployment rate for people living in these communities are 3 to 4 times higher than non-Indigenous communities. Safe and adequate housing affects Indigenous health. We look at 2021, there's 37% of people in Indigenous communities living in homes requiring major repairs versus 12% of non-Indigenous people. Things like poor air quality, black mold contribute to higher rates of respiratory diseases like asthma or COPD. In 2021, 35% of Indigenous communities lived in crowded homes, compared to only 9% of non-Indigenous Canadians, with overcrowding contributing to an alarming rate of infectious diseases of Indigenous populations. With this in mind, we start to realize just how dangerous COVID-19 was. And according to the federal government, at any given point in time, there are over 100 drinking water advisories still in effect in First Nations in Canada. Is it any wonder then that waterborne diseases in Indigenous communities is 26 times the national average? This is a chief of Little Saskatchewan Reserve in Manitoba. A Health Canada official told him the water's fine to drink, but a private lab told him not to bathe his dog in it. The Heart and Stroke Foundation of Canada states that heart disease rates for Indigenous people are as much as 50% higher than non-Indigenous Canadians, and the death rate from stroke is twice as high. In 2018, the Indigenous rate of diabetes is almost 2 times higher than non-Indigenous. The rate of tuberculosis, 34 times higher than non-Indigenous. And age-standardized hospitalization rates for people living on reserve are 2.5 times or 2.7 times higher for Indigenous females than for and 2.4 times higher for Indigenous males. But what about addictions and mental health? Well, the rate of mental health hospitalization is 3 times higher than non-Indigenous. Hospitalization for intentional self-harm is 7.3 times higher. The rate of suicide is 3 times higher. A couple of years ago, there was an Indigenous community here in Alberta of 10,000 people. It had 70 suicides in a 4-month period. In Alberta, we look at the opioid crisis. You know, the rate of opioid poisoning deaths is 229 deaths per 100,000. That's 6 deaths a day. And the rate of Indigenous opioid poisoning deaths is almost 8.5 times higher than the rate of non-Indigenous opioid deaths. In fact, multiple Indigenous communities have declared states of emergency in response to opioid deaths. I was in an Indigenous community here in Alberta to talk about opioid deaths. And when I went to Tim Hortons and I asked for the biggest box of donuts they had, they said, this guy wants a wake box. And I said, why do you call it a wake box? And they said, because the people in community always buy them for the funeral wakes. Now, this graph is absolutely shocking. And guess what? It does not include the non-status Indigenous people. It doesn't include Métis people, and it doesn't include Inuit people. So this graph is literally the tip of the iceberg of how bad this problem actually is. So what does all this translate to in terms of Indigenous health, and what are the implications for Indigenous people? It means they die younger. 2016, Alberta was in the national news when it was discovered Indigenous Albertans were living 12 years less than the non-Indigenous population. Today, life expectancy is 18.2 years shorter than for First Nations people living in Alberta. In 2016, the Indigenous infant mortality rate was twice as high as non-Indigenous Albertans. Now, some people are reluctant to call this an Indigenous health crisis, or even a violation of basic human rights. But I don't know how anybody could see a group of people living 10 to 18 years less than the rest of the population and regard it as anything but. So how do we move forward as health services? And how do we move beyond this Indigenous health crisis? Well, the first thing we need to do is remove the biggest and oldest systemic barrier to healthcare there is. Well, what's that? Well, we only need to look at the newspaper headlines to answer that question. Here we have Brian Sinclair. He dies in a Manitoba emergency department. A double amputee in a wheelchair who's presumed intoxicated and told to go away. He dies of sepsis sitting in the emergency department, and his body is discovered 34 hours later with rigor mortis. There's an emergency room in BC where nurses and doctors were playing Price is Right, placing bets on the blood alcohol level of Indigenous patients. This woman almost died when she was presumed intoxicated, but was actually found to be severely dehydrated. Some of us might remember the AHS staff in Alberta fired for racial slurs directed at leaders of an Indigenous community. In 2022, there was the McLean study in Alberta that looked at 11 million emergency room visits, and they found that Indigenous patients were consistently triaged as less urgent than non-Indigenous patients who had the exact same diagnosis. Of course, there's the tragic death of Joyce Echaquan in Quebec, where she filmed nurse saying horribly racist things to her as she died, saying she was better off dead. And a few months after Joyce's death, 2 more nurses were fired after Jocelyn Ottawa went to a clinic for a wound dressing on her foot. The nurses humiliated her, saying they preferred to call her Joyce. They demanded that she sing songs for them in her native language. It was only then that she realized they had taken away her phone for the duration of the appointment. And there's this article here, as a 2020 PHAC study that compared Indigenous women to non-Indigenous women. And they found a higher prevalence of diagnosed chronic diseases, mental health issues, and many others, even when adjusted for similar age, education, income, and location. Now, these are stories that point to a national problem of systemic racism in healthcare. In fact, Federal Indigenous Services Minister Honorable Patty Hajdu attended a public forum following the death of Joyce Echaquan and later said, "Sadly, this is not shocking to me. Racism is not an accident. The system is not broken. It was created this way, and the people in the system are incentivized to stay the same." You might be thinking to yourself, well, this is all mainstream media, right? Trying to sell the news. Well, numerous independent investigations and commission reports had confirmed it in the past. The TRC report in 2015 looked at Indigenous health inequities. First People, Second Class Treatment comes out in 2015 by the Wellesley Institute. Out of Sight in 2017. Key Health Inequalities in Canada, a National Portrait, is released by PHAC in 2018. The Vines Report in 2019. In Plain Sight comes out in 2020. Surveyed 9,000 Indigenous people, 84% of whom said they experienced racism in healthcare. This is all fairly new discovery, right? Wrong. RCAP came out over 37 years ago, the final report being 5 volumes long, 3,347 pages, documented Indigenous discrimination in Canada. And in 2016, 20 years after its release, a 72-year-old Paul Chartrand, one of the original commissioners of this report, is quoted as saying, "There's a very powerful lesson in all of this, and that is to say, I don't think anything has changed." And the cost of racism and discrimination. Research has shown that stigma, racism, and discrimination can result in chronic stress, increasing what what McEwen and Steller called allostatic load. This is the cumulative burden of chronic stress and life events, the physiological wear and tear on our bodies. Allostatic overload resulting in dysregulation, inflammation, vascular problems that over time increase that risk of chronic health problems, cardiovascular disease, mental health. And there are these bidirectional relationships. Each one of these factors contributes to a cumulative effect, but they exacerbate each other and what Johnson and Abikchuk called bidirectional relationships. And studies have repeatedly shown that when white people increase their socioeconomic status, their health improves. But when minorities increase their socioeconomic status, their health does not improve. Other studies have shown middle-class people are far more likely to get referrals to specialist treatment. So this isn't just about someone's feelings being hurt. There are very real health consequences associated with stigma, racism, and discrimination. And so ACEs, social determinants of health, low socioeconomic status, stigma, racism, discrimination, all set in motion the perfect storm. That is what I call the Indigenous health crisis, in which Indigenous people are dying faster and younger. So where do we go from here? Well, Canadians need to understand that colonization was designed to displace and disconnect Indigenous people from their communities, from their families, and from their culture. They need to understand that the health inequities that we experience as Indigenous people represent the embodiment of the structural and systemic disadvantages that were installed through colonization. They need to understand that the poor Indigenous health outcomes are not an accident. The colonial system was designed to oppress, and the poor health outcomes are a direct result of that oppression. And so to reverse these inequities, we need to decolonize health services. But what is decolonization? Well, according to Dr. Linda Tohiwai Smith, who literally wrote the book on decolonization in 1999, she said, Indigenous decolonization describes that ongoing theoretical and political process whose goal is to contest and reframe narratives about Indigenous community histories and the effects of colonial expansion, cultural assimilation, exploitive Western research, and often, though not inherent, genocide. Dr. Smith is a Maori from New Zealand, and my wife is from New Zealand, and so might actually score some points with mentioning Dr. Smith here today. But what does this look like in practical application? What does it look like in a modern healthcare system? Well, the first step to decolonizing healthcare requires acknowledging that legacy of colonialism in healthcare and the truth and consequences of it. Then it requires collective action, not promises, not commitments, but action to identify and remove colonial systems that continue to act as barriers to healthcare for Indigenous people. And this means removing and replacing systems, policies, and procedures that create healthcare disadvantages for Indigenous people. It means addressing racism and discrimination on a systemic level. How can we ever build trust with Indigenous communities if we refuse to embrace the very values we proclaim to uphold as healthcare professionals? Instead of protecting the status quo, rotten apples will fall off growing trees. Finally, it means working with Indigenous communities to find healthcare systems that work for them. And people always ask me, yeah, that's going to cost money. Who's going to pay for all this? And I say the same people who paid the $40 billion settlement that the federal government was found to be willfully discriminating against Indigenous children in child welfare system, or the $30 billion that had to be paid out when it was found to be discriminating against Indigenous people in terms of access to clean water. We will pay for this. We can pay for it now, or we can pay for it later, a little now or a lot later. Now, any steps towards decolonizing health needs to start with implementation of TRC's health calls to action, talking about implementing the treaty right to healthcare, establishing measurable goals, recognizing distinct needs for Indigenous health, funding for healing centers, recognizing Indigenous health and healing practices, increasing Indigenous health professionals, and medical and nursing school curriculums need to be reviewed. Now, empathy does not happen in a vacuum, and neither does racism. Racism grows from a lack of understanding. It's like we know empathy grows with greater understanding. So how do we replace racism with empathy? Well, we facilitate that greater understanding. We can expand education and awareness of Indigenous health beyond cultural competency, create an understanding of things we've talked about today, the trauma of Indigenous people, the role of social determinants of health, the current Indigenous health context. We can talk about trauma-informed care, and ultimately a comprehensive strategy to address racism and discrimination in healthcare. Things like addressing unconscious bias. I found this picture on a wall in a community service in Calgary. I took a picture of it because it's something that I had heard in New Zealand 1,000 times. I used to do these patient death reviews in New Zealand, trying to figure out where things went wrong when a patient died. And the doctors and the nurses would always say the same thing. Why was the patient moved here? Why was the patient in restraints? And the answer was always the same. We've always done it that way. Researchers like Mark Exworthy have used the term path dependency to describe this phenomenon. And change is always challenging in healthcare, but without challenge, there's no change. And we need to understand that healthcare is always changing. It's dynamic, never static. Decolonizing health services will require change. And so we need to keep a keen eye on that change management process and emphasize the importance of community engagement within it. I was going to get a little bit into data development and research here. But ultimately, I wanted to say that best practice is often at odds with Indigenous culture and values. Best practice implies one approach is better than another. In Indigenous culture and wisdom, we have never keep score on something as important as health. All approaches to help people in need would be regarded as valuable or helpful to healing. Best practice is subjective. It's rooted in values, local context, worldview, perception, what we perceive as valuable. So we need to be careful with how we employ or deploy strategies when we use the term best practice. And certainly in the case of Indigenous health, it's been replaced with something called wise practice. Dr. Albert Marshall talking about two-eyed seeing, using the benefits of Western-based health research with Indigenous ways of knowing and being. And here I talk a little bit about, the idea that we need to emphasize the value of qualitative data in Indigenous program development and research. And in a culture that has so much of its identity rooted in oral tradition, it only makes sense that we consider individual stories and experiences in program development and research. And this shouldn't be regarded as a credibility deficit, but a strength. And certainly in some of the research I've done, we've in the Indigenous patient journey projects, for example, we saw that Indigenous service users will only go to a service in a way that works for them, or they won't access it at all. So we have to develop and design our services in a way that works for them. It's there. But talking about supporting Indigenous communities, this is a picture of me signing a multilateral MOU with Enoch Cree Nation, signed by 4 levels of government establishing partnerships in Indigenous healthcare. And we need to replace these prescriptive paternal funding mechanisms in Indigenous healthcare and come back to that collaborative spirit of mutual respect and understanding. Government often says, you need this program, write a grant proposal, and maybe we'll fund it for you. And here's the problem with that. A community's needs shouldn't be determined by a bureaucrat 400 miles away, but by the community struggling to meet those needs. We also need to shift from a crisis response to an upstream prevention. Excuse me. Moving along here. So what does this all mean? And so what now, the trauma of losing your culture, your language, your identity, the trauma of neglect, emotional, physical, sexual abuse, coupled with the loss of parenting role models. Many Indigenous people who were abused and neglected in residential school went on to abuse and neglect their own children. And so many had their children taken away. And so that cycle of Indigenous trauma repeats itself. There are now more Indigenous people incarcerated in Canada than there were Black people incarcerated at the height of apartheid. There are more Indigenous children in foster care than there were ever in care at the height of residential schools. Indigenous youth are one of the fastest growing segments of Canada's population, and they're top of the list for Canadians most likely to die young. The need for active steps towards reconciliation in Indigenous health is not going away. It's growing exponentially. Now, it's easy to hear these heartbreaking realities, become overwhelmed with the sheer scope of the problem, to feel sad, angry, and maybe even lose hope. But I assure you there's much to be hopeful for. The recovery in Kamloops and Kalwasis had shocked the country. 211 children, 211 graves found. There are now active ground-penetrating radar searches across the country. What we need to understand is that the voices of those children were heard, and they woke a sleeping giant. From coast to coast and around the world, people were standing up and they were speaking out and they were saying, every child matters. Many Canadians were seeing and hearing that truth for the first time. So I believe this journey to reconciliation can begin. There's a quote from Senator Murray Sinclair, who says, "The road we travel is equal in importance to the destination we seek. There are no shortcuts. When it comes to truth and reconciliation, we're all forced to go the distance." That's inscribed on the wall of his law school. You might be asking yourself, so what difference can I make? What can I do? Well, you can help others to recognize Indigenous health crisis as a human rights issue. We've done study after study for 25 years, and they've all said the same thing. And we need action beyond inquiries and political lip service. And that only comes when we recognize Indigenous health inequity for the human rights violation that it has been and it continues to be. You can help others understand the importance of trauma-informed care and the role of social determinants in Indigenous health. You can be an ally, you can stand up, and you can speak out against racism wherever and whenever you see it. And that means being an ally all the time, not just in the boardroom and not just when you're standing at the podium. You can identify opportunities in your organization to decolonize health services for Indigenous patients. Consider developing a reconciliation action plan, something that incorporates Indigenous truth, ways of knowing and being. You can help build Indigenous trust in healthcare and make healthcare system a safe place for Indigenous people. Apologies for using this picture 3 times. It's actually one of only 3 pictures that remain from my childhood. The human brain is remarkable. It will do everything it can to protect us from trauma. And I remember the trauma of my childhood like it happened yesterday. But my little sister remembers absolutely nothing of her childhood. Her brain has hidden the trauma so well that even the good memories are gone. In the beginning of this presentation, I told you about my mother and the trauma she experienced as a child. Then I told you about the trauma her children experienced. And so where are they now? Well, both my sisters, both of my sisters have long histories of dysfunctional relationships and domestic violence. Both my sisters have been to addiction treatment more than once. Both my sisters have had their children taken away and placed in foster care at one time or another. One of my sisters lost a child to the opioid crisis. Now, we have all continued to have struggles with physical health, mental health, substance abuse, and even the criminal justice system. Had, I should say. You drown not by falling into a river, but by staying submerged into it. There's a quote there from Paulo Coelho, and it really does describe how I see my life. Escaping the trauma of our childhood has been difficult for all three of us, and indeed, some of us remain submerged. But through the course of my adult life, I've learned many things. I've learned that healing is a lifelong process. Some days are harder than others, but it gets easier over time. I've learned about the power of unconditional love and the healing that can only be found in forgiveness. And like my mother before me, I too found a way out. I followed her footsteps through university, and I built a career that has taken me around the world. And like my mother too, I have achieved many of the dreams I once thought impossible. Once an angry and violent young man, I'm now a warm and loving father who's built a safe and happy home for his family. And this has now become my transcendent purpose, my reason for being. The Indigenous cycle of trauma might not stop with my sisters and their children, but it'll certainly stop with me and mine. Please understand that Indigenous truth and reconciliation is not an attempt to make you feel guilty, nor is it an effort to instill you with a sense of shame. Shame is the enemy of reconciliation because it replaces conversations with silence. Indigenous truth and reconciliation is not a cry for sympathy or pity. It's a plea for understanding. Without conversation, there will be no understanding. And without understanding, there will be no reconciliation. So please understand that you have an important role to play in Indigenous reconciliation, but it's up to you to discover what that role will be. I'd like to leave you with a final thought on the traumatized mice and the cherry blossoms we discussed at the beginning. When the traumatized mice were sprayed with the cherry blossom scent without the electric shock, they eventually stopped reacting to it. Their brains had actually rewired the response to the point their sperm no longer held that epigenetic signature of the trauma response. It's early days, but the study suggests that once trauma is removed from the equation, traumatized brains can be reprogrammed, so we no longer live in fear. Maybe we can recover from trauma to the point where it disappears from our DNA. And maybe as health professionals, we can help stop the cycles of Indigenous trauma from being passed on to the next generation and the cycle that continues to turn over and over. Maybe as health professionals, we can ensure those next generations have greater health equity so that we can all move towards reconciliation, not just as individuals and families, but as friends, neighbors, and communities. Thank you all for being here today, and thank you for listening. Kiniano Skumitnan, hi. That's my presentation for today.